From Brown Cow Studios in Bozeman, Montana, this is News Nerds. I'm Mr. Graham. This week, Democratic gubernatorial candidates lay out their vision for the future of Montana. Former firearms executive Ryan Bussey and lawyer Raph Graybill are running to defeat incumbent Republican Greg Gianforte. Gianforte is the founder of the software company Right Now Technologies and was first elected to public office as Montana's lone congressman in 2017. Since then, Montana has gained a congressional seat, and Gianforte was elected as governor. Bussey and Graybill have campaigned for public land, abortion and healthcare access, property tax reform, and responsible gun ownership. Last Tuesday, the Bussey campaign won their Democratic primary with 71% of the vote, and the Gianforte campaign won their primary at about 75%. It's Wednesday, June 12th, and this is News Nerds. Joining me now are Ryan Bussey and Raph Graybill. From 1995 to 2020, Ryan Bussey worked in the gun industry as the vice president of sales for Kimber America. This sparked his 2021 book, Gunfight: My Battle Against the Industry That Radicalized America, and a period in his life when he began to question his political beliefs. His sons were two of the 16 plaintiffs in Held v. Montana, a landmark climate lawsuit fought against the state government that alleged state agencies have implemented policy in violation of the right to a clean and healthful environment, which was ratified into the 1972 Montana State Constitution. A state court sided with the plaintiffs and struck down two state laws preventing agencies from considering the climate impacts of proposed projects. Bussey announced his candidacy for governor against incumbent Republican Greg Gianforte in 2023 and tapped Raph Graybill as his running mate for lieutenant governor. Graybill is a lawyer based in Helena and has argued 12 lawsuits against the Gianforte administration. He's won cases related to abortion and mail ballot access. He was former Democratic Governor Steve Bullock's chief legal counsel and ran for attorney general in 2020. During his time with the Bullock administration, Raph worked at the Department of Military Affairs, chairing the Montana State Emergency Response Commission. Thanks so much, you guys, for being with me today.
Hey, it's awesome to be here. And I got to say, that is a serious professional microphone you got right there. That's a big deal, podcast microphone.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Thanks for, shouting it out. So I wanted to know, Raph was
Yeah.
added to the ticket in February. So how did you guys meet?
Oh boy. I don't even remember exactly where we met, but Rafe and I ran in similar political circles going back at least a decade. I volunteered. I was a board chairman for Montana Conservation Voters, and Rafe has always been a big supporter of his family. And obviously, he's been politically active. So somewhere along the way, at some conservation event or series of them, Rafe and I became acquainted and friends a decade ago.
And people like me have been asking Ryan to run for governor for about as long as I've known him. So I'm glad he's doing it.
I'm going to read a passage from your book, Gunfight, and this kind of gets at your ideological shift. So I'll read from a chapter about public land access and specifically the Badger 2 medicine area. You write, quote, "The land we all own as Americans is the one concrete component of our great egalitarian experiment. The rights and laws that form our system are beautiful, no doubt, but they are only words. Our great public lands are not just ideas, they can also be touched just like any other physical object. The fact that we own them together as citizens is, for me, the single finest example of equality in our democracy," end quote. And this chapter is specifically talking about the 2000s when George W. Bush was looking into energy expansion on some of these public lands. And then just a page later, you talk about some of the cracks in your ideology. And you talk about your wife, Sarah, who encouraged these changes in beliefs. Did your family have a large part in how your politics have changed in the past years?
Yeah, of course, my family did. Both my own immediate family, my wife and my boys, also my father, who raised me with a conservation ethic and a respect for wild places. Yes, I do believe all of that stuff, and I believe strongly in our Constitution and all the rights that are enumerated in our Constitution, both our state Constitution and our national Constitution. But I think, like so many things in Montana and around Montana, this is kind of where the rubber meets the road, right? on do we really have these rights and are we really equal? There's so many things about Montana that equalize us, public lands being one of them. And I just think it's such a there isn't another country that has done what we've done where you don't have to be a king or a landed gentry or a kid with a bunch of trust funds to experience this sort of big, wild outdoor country and reliance on nature that we can. And that's a tremendously egalitarian thing. And there are a lot of other things like that in Montana. Our Montana Constitution, which Rafe's grandfather was the chair of in 1972, gives us all access, guarantees us access to equal public education. It guarantees us access to knowledge, and so there are these things that we have in our Constitution, and then there are the physical manifestation of them. And I do believe that our stream access and our public lands in Montana are exactly that.
Well, now turning to Rafe's background, one thing that stuck out to me just reading from the campaign website was his background at Guantanamo. There are, other things too that were mentioned. Of course, you served for 4 years with the New York City Police Department. As I mentioned in the introduction, you work in Helena in your family law practice with your uncle. And then, as Ryan was just mentioning, your grandfather was one of the people that helped to make that 1972 Constitution that we now have in Montana. You're also a graduate of Great Falls High School, Yale, Oxford, and Columbia. But there's been some recent reporting about Guantanamo and some of the even ex-Bush officials who have said that many of the detainees at Gitmo are innocent. So looking back on your time there, in college, prosecuting terrorism suspects, how do you feel about that time?
Well, so for background, when I was in law school, I worked with the prosecutor's office that prosecuted war crimes for certain Guantanamo suspects. And I can't give all of the details of the cases I worked on for security reasons, but I can tell you the cases I worked on were people who were very guilty, who had said they were guilty, who were proud of their role in terrorist attacks against U.S. service members, proud of their role in 9/11, people who needed to be prosecuted under the law of war. That was a time when, unfortunately, Congress prevented the prosecution of these folks in our Article 3 court system. And so the only option that was left to the president at that point was prosecuting under the military law of war system. But I can tell you the folks I worked on their cases, I don't think there was any doubt about their guilt or innocence. Can't speak to all the detainees there in the different categories, but the folks I worked on were very proud of their role in some horrific terrorist attacks against Americans, and they deserve due process. But I was on the side of folks making sure that they stayed behind bars and were accountable for their role in really horrific acts against Americans.
I want to turn now to property taxes. This is something that have been reading a lot about because there's a lot of different layers to this issue, but it's been a big debate in the past few years for Montanans, and I think, you guys have said that this is one of the unifying factors when you're campaigning between Republicans and Democrats. So before I ask a few questions about this, I want to give some background. This is my understanding of, what's gone down. During the reappraisal cycle that the Montana Department of Revenue has completed in the recent years, many homes gained value, which of course equated to higher property taxes. And at the same time, we had a $2.5 billion budget surplus. Many have been angry about that property tax increase. There's been various solutions that have been, brought up. One big issue that your campaign specifically has been latching onto is that property tax increase. You've posted pictures of your billboards around the state that simply read Greg Gianforte raise your property taxes with a logo of your campaign. And so there's been, this argument that Greg Gianforte and the Republican-led legislature, both in the House and Senate in Montana, could have tweaked the tax code following reappraisal. And that has been something that has done in years past under different governors. Also, something that is worth noting is that residential properties specifically have a higher tax burden than in prior years. Reporting from KTVQ News says that in 1994, 38% of property taxes were paid by residential areas, and last year was 52% of property taxes. My question is, how much of this blame is on Gianforte, who you're running against, and then how much of this blame is on the state legislature?
Yeah, so most of what you said is technically correct there, Ezra. I will elaborate or clarify just a bit. So previous governors in the last 44 years have faced a similar circumstance to this. And there's only one person who is ultimately responsible for that tax code, and that's the governor. And in this case, also the leader of the party who controls both legislative houses. And so the governor and the legislative leaders, again from his party, and he's the leader of the party, were told with a legislative memo or a budget memo well prior to the session that this was going to happen, right? As you said, home values were going up. People knew that. Reappraisals were happening. People knew that. The budget memo said that, and it said, essentially, I'll boil it down, but you can go read the budget memo. It's out there. It basically said, hey, look, you better adjust this rate like other governors, or homeowners' property taxes are going to go way up, i.e., increase the burden on homeowners. And conversely, importantly, it will reduce the burden dramatically on industry. Well, they looked at that memo, and not only did they read it and absorb it, they said, great. They put it in their budget, right? So when they say this is some kind of accident, or it's the county's fault, or it's the teacher's fault, or it's the school's fault, or blah, 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 wrong. They got the memo. They said, okay, they did nothing, where 4 previous governors had done something very easily, just adjust the rate. And then they put it in their budget. So it was a very conscious decision. They said, yeah, we got this multi-billion-dollar surplus, and we're going to decide to raise taxes. Ultimately, the governor is responsible for that. He was presented with the memo. He chose to go right along with it, right with legislators. And here we are in a time when pipeline companies, Northwestern Energy, great big companies, had their taxes dramatically reduced, and every single homeowner and renter in the state had their taxes and or rent dramatically increased. It was a very conscious decision.
And some of the things that your campaign has been pointing out is that, as you were just saying, the Northwestern Energy Company, and how under the $2.5 billion budget surplus, income taxes were lowered, and which came out to $36 million just this year for Northwestern Energy. Also, the rebates that you were mentioning, those are only short term over the next 2 years, and renters can't get those rebates right now. And also the rebates that you have
That's
to
correct.
apply for. And so when you
Right.
see this policy,
Lots of Montanans didn't get those rebates. Lots of
right,
Montanans did not get those rebates because it asks for data that the state has. It asks for geocodes. It asks for previous year's taxes. The state has all this. They send you your tax bill. They know all of it. Why did they make people fill out these forms, go on the website, understand what their geocode is? There are fixed income folks that Rafe and I run into all the time that they don't know what their geocode was. They didn't even know they were supposed to get this rebate. They got this big property tax increase, and then they're told they didn't qualify for a rebate that they thought they were supposed to get. Well, they were supposed to get it because they didn't. There was too much red tape wrapped around it. So not only did Gianforte and the Republicans raise taxes, then they do this little trick telling everybody that they get a rebate, but a huge portion of the people didn't get it because there's so much red tape around it. I mean, you could be forgiven for thinking that they're trying to make it hard on working folks. Why could you be forgiven for that? Because it's true. It's true.
It's about 60 some thousand households. So about as many households as are in Yellowstone County were eligible and didn't get the rebate. And the other thing about those rebates is that's a one-time deal. What prior governors have done is they permanently lower the tax rate, so you don't have to go through this nonsense every year. And for many folks, it wasn't enough money to cover the increase. I mean, I think about friends of mine. I grew up in Great Falls. Friends who moved to Missoula or Bozeman for school, and they buy a house in, say, 2010, back when houses are a lot more affordable. Their house might be worth a lot more on paper, and they might be a teacher or a nurse or something, but they're paying 3, 4, 5, 6, 7,000 more dollars in property taxes year over year. A $600 one-time rebate doesn't help somebody paying 5,000 more dollars.
So if you were elected, what would be the long-term solutions that you would pursue?
Well, the very first thing we have to do, and people try to muddle the waters, especially some of the legislators who know they stepped in this, and Gianforte, they try to tell you how complex it is. Let's start with a really simple, mostly or at least partial solution. That is, adjust the rate, just like you just change it to 0.94, just like other governors have done. It's not a hard thing. It's a quick little page-and-a-half bill, takes 45 minutes. Let's start with that. Now, if there are other places that we need to examine tax fairness, okay. But and we should examine those, no doubt about it. But the simplicity of fixing this tax rate, just like Gianforte's own budget department told him this is what to do, and they didn't do it. So we would simply take the advice of that budget memo. It's there for us to read and take and enact, and we'd be happy to do it.
Would you consider shifting some of the tax burden away from residential homes onto businesses?
I think we have to be very careful, especially for our small, family-owned businesses. Small businesses drive much of Montana, and I think we have to be careful not to allow the burden to pile up on small business. I think that in balancing the taxes, there would be some taxes that would go back onto large pipelines and Northwestern Energy, because when you equalize the taxes, that's what's going to happen. But I think we have to be real careful about piling burden onto small business.
And just to be clear, the folks that got the real windfall from this property tax shift you talked about, where we as homeowners, renters pay more, big industry pays less, the windfall really went to the biggest taxpayers. It went to telecommunications companies, oil pipelines, railroads. You mentioned Northwestern Energy getting, over $35 million in a tax break. I mean, that's a company that pays its CEO $3 million a year. They made tens of millions in profit last year, and they're a state-sponsored monopoly. I mean, like, you can't choose anyone else. They're already doing fine at the Public Service Commission. They're not I think Main Street businesses, we should absolutely protect those folks, but does Northwestern need $36 million in free money on our backs? Like, no, absolutely not.
This is maybe another question for Rafe here, because I know this was one of the things that you were running on in 2020 against Austin Knudsen, who is the current Attorney General in the state. But healthcare has been a big issue. I know you've talked to people around the state about how to best deliver on healthcare. What have you heard from Montanans, and how do you plan to address that?
People are really worried in Montana about losing access to healthcare in middle-sized and small towns. People are especially worried about losing access to primary care doctors, to mental health and addiction services, to specialists, even in big cities. And the reason people are worried is Gianforte is systematically dismantling one of the most important payers in the system, and that's Medicaid. Montana's expanded Medicaid services, well over 100,000 people who have lost their coverage because Gianforte's kicked them off. Now, that's a huge moral failing on Gianforte's part when it comes to those individuals that lose their care, particularly the 36,000 or so kids that don't have access to health insurance anymore. That's a big problem. But it's even bigger than just the folks on Medicaid. Medicaid is sort of the linchpin of a healthy, vibrant healthcare system. And if you want ambulance service in Big Timber, if you want good primary care options in Havre or in Malta, if you want, not to have to go to Seattle to work on your knee, all of those sort of availability of good healthcare is supported by a vibrant Medicaid program that Gianforte is intentionally breaking off and selling for parts. And people are healthcare executives, patients, people are very worried about that. Gianforte is doing it intentionally. He said so himself. It's called the Medicaid unwinding. He says it's working as intended, and it's a disaster.
Yeah, and I think too, Ezra, we got Medicaid expansion done because we had a Democratic governor who worked with and called good, reasonable, decent Republicans to do the right thing for the state. It happened under Steve Bullock when Rafe was there under the Bullock administration, and we have now coming down the pike reconsideration of Medicaid expansion in 2025. And Rafe's right, rural healthcare is on the line, rest homes, rural healthcare, but really basic healthcare that people depend upon in our larger cities, Kalispell, Missoula, Great Falls, Billings, Bozeman, all of these places, tons of healthcare options are on the line there too, because as Rafe said, Medicaid funds them. We don't often see that, but ambulance services largely funded by Medicaid, mental health coverage largely funded by Medicaid, substance abuse programs largely funded by Medicaid. So these guys have said they want Medicaid expansion to be rolled back or done away with. If that happens, if Gianforte gets his way, and if this small band of radical Republicans get their way, you can count on ambulance services going away, substance abuse programs going away, mental health care going away. In our largest cities, it's going to dramatically stress our healthcare system. And it doesn't need to be that way. Medicaid is a 90% federally funded program. And the 10% that the state funds is a fantastic investment. Rafe and I hear stories all the time about this. Sometimes we walk right into them. We walked right into a meeting in Billings where a guy had been kicked off his Medicaid because Gianforte did it. He shouldn't have been kicked off. He couldn't afford his heart meds. He was in there in the hospital where we were because he had been kicked off and didn't take his heart meds, and he was in the ICU because he had a terrible healthcare situation. 5 minutes in the ICU is more expensive than those heart meds. So it's not good business to do this.
When you were watching Held v. Montana, Ryan, what were some of the takeaways from that case that have informed your policy for this campaign?
It was quite something to see. Montana should be very proud. We have this wonderful 1972 Constitution. The beginning witness was Maid Ann Ellingson. She wrote Article 9, the right to a clean and healthful environment. And I think those framers of our Constitution were visionary. Our environment here in Montana is something very special to us. It's special to me personally, tangibly, right? Clean water. I love to fly fish. I love to hunt. I don't know who doesn't like clean water and clean air. It seems pretty important. So for me, it felt like a moment of pride to be involved in that trial and to see those kids stand up for their constitutional rights. And as I say, they're just constitutional conservatives. The court was very clear, and the framers of the Constitution are very clear. These kids and all of us have a right to a clean and healthful environment. I don't know who wouldn't celebrate people standing up for their constitutional rights.
I'm going to read from a New York Times article that was just published by Jonathan Weissman. He came to Montana and talked to you guys about your strategy for running. One of the things that he wrote about was abortion and how Rafe has been working on that. So this is a quote from that article. Now, in addition to running for lieutenant governor, Mr. Graybill is leading the legal fight to get an amendment to the state constitution that would explicitly protect abortion access onto the Montana ballot this November, end quote. And just for some statistics on who supports abortion in the state, according to Pew Research, I think this is a little bit outdated, but it was about 56%. There was a poll done by Middle Fork Strategies that was more recent that said 6 in 10 voters said that abortion should remain legal in the state in all or many circumstances. And very few Montanans support amending the Constitution in a way that would change the right to privacy or change what's already written down. Rafe, what is this effort looking like for you?
Well, what this proposed amendment, it's called CI 128, and there's an effort right now to get signatures. What it does is it further clarifies the protections around abortion in our state constitution. So right now, the right to abortion is found in the right to privacy. This creates an additional protection in case there's ever any challenge in a future court that looks to undo prior precedent. So it further strengthens and reinforces that right. It's something that is very popular in Montana. You know, we are, if anything, a state that doesn't like government in our private affairs. And there's nothing more private, more intimate than a decision about whether to start a family or when to start a family. Montanans have always been very pro-choice, and I think that's reflected in how well this initiative has been received. A lot of people are signing it. I was involved early on in the role getting it through the courts, where there were some attempts by politicians in Montana to try to stop it. The Attorney General and the Secretary of State worked very hard to try to stop this from going on the ballot. And we said, no, people ought to get a chance to express their voice and have a choice in this initiative. And we're currently about 10 days out from the end of signature collection.
I just want to say, regardless of whether you're, directly for or against abortion, I'm not sure that's the question here. The question is, do you want the governor making the decision for you? I think it should be up to Montanans to choose what they do in their most intimate decisions when and if to start a family. It's not the governor's decision. And that's really what this is about.
Do you know the progress right now on the amendment and the signatures?
My understanding is that they're on track for signatures. I don't have an exact number today, but anyone that wants to sign or get involved in collecting signatures should just look up. The group is called Montanans Securing Reproductive Rights. If you just Google that, Montanans Securing Reproductive Rights, you can go to the website and figure out where to sign it or sign up to volunteer. There's really good training on how to do it correctly. And I think it's kind of an all hands on deck thing till the final day.
Somebody tried to get me to sign on Main Street. I'm not a voter, though. I have a question from a voter in Bozeman named Marcia about polling. And she was referencing, I believe, a poll that was done earlier in the year. And that this may or may not even have been while Rafe was on the campaign. So this is a fairly old poll. But basically, it was saying that Greg Gianforte, although he has fairly low approval ratings, that there may not be enough people that would split a ballot in this red state. The exact quote was, and this is from Survey USA. It says, quote, data suggests that Republican candidate Greg Gianforte would likely emerge as the victor, end quote. Marcia wants to know, how accurate do you think polling is, especially in Montana?
I think polling, and Montana is a notoriously difficult place to poll. First off, I don't mean large L libertarian. We're small L libertarian, right? We don't like people telling us what to do. We don't like people poking around in our business. And we're very independent. Like, how do you get a hold of people when they're out rafting the river, right? So we're difficult to poll. That being said, look, the governor has run for statewide office before. Rafe has run. I have never run. That was several months ago. I think that polling gives a snapshot in time of what some people think, and I think if you ran polls today, you'd see a very, very tight race, and I think it's going to continue to be tight given the difficulty of polling in the state. We don't really live and die by polling. Rafe and I have our pedal to the metal. We have from day one. I have from day one, and we believe that we're going to win this race. I think anybody that hangs around with us on any of our events or our campaigning sees we're going to win it. And I think polls will eventually show more of that, even as sort of fraught and inaccurate as they can be.
Yeah, and the thing I'd add to that too is, we just had recently had an event with former Governor Schweitzer, who told us about in 2004 when he was running for governor. Everyone told him, oh, it's going to be so hard to beat this incumbent Republican, Judy Marks, who then drops out of the race. And Schweitzer, wins with 60% in a year when Democrats were never supposed to come out ahead. We've elected since that time, Democratic governors for 16 out of the last 19 years. This is a state that really prides itself on independence. And historically, other than 2020, when it comes to the governor's race, people say, I'm going to look at state issues. I'm going to vote for the person, not the party. It can be tougher in these federal races, like running for U.S. House. It's hard not to talk about national issues. But gosh, when you're running for governor, we're talking about your taxes. We're talking about your kids' ability to afford to live here when they graduate school and want to live in the place they grew up in. And you're talking about public schools, talking about access to healthcare. Those are local issues where Montanans time and again say person over party. And on those metrics, we feel really good.
Yeah, and just on the history here, Schweitzer and Bullock, they were elected with crossover votes. And John Tester has been elected 3 times with crossover votes. We're going to be elected with crossover votes. There's a rich history of this in Montana. So anybody who thinks that that's not the case, they don't have to trust me. Just look at history. It's right there.
There was this really interesting op-ed that Rafe wrote that I wanted to talk about because it was appealing to Tanner Smith voters. And for people that don't know, Tanner Smith was trying to primary Greg Gianforte. Our primaries were last Tuesday. And, obviously you guys won that primary. Tell me about that op-ed that you wrote, because that was really appealing to Republicans that felt disenfranchised by the current governor.
Yeah, the basic message, and folks listening can find this in the Daily Interlake or the Red Lodge paper or the Missoula Current. I think something that Ryan and I have felt on the campaign trail that kind of turned into this op-ed was that really people have a lot more in common than national political pundits will allow us to admit. And if we can kind of put aside some of the divisive national political questions and just focus on saving the state that we love, that's made us better people, there's a lot we have in common. And when we think about Tanner Smith supporters, we think about folks that don't want their property taxes increased, particularly when there is a giant government surplus. They don't want the reckless spending of Governor Gianforte. They don't want Montana's wildlife to be commercialized and sold off at a price tag to rich bajillionaires from Texas. They don't want their great public schools to fail and be turned into sort of a 2-track system where there's a special taxpayer-funded Petra Academy like Gianforte has for private, rich kids, and then something for everybody else. Those are kind of basic Montana values, and they are at stake and in focus in this election. And I think the same frustrations that people who maybe on national politics side more with me and Ryan have are the frustrations that folks in Tanner Smith's camp have. And so this op-ed was an attempt to say, look, let's agree to disagree on the national stuff. We can't change that. We're just little Montana over here. But what we can do is get a new governor.
Amen.
Have you guys thought about the libertarian vote? Kaiser Lieb and Matt Campbell are running as libertarians in this election. How do you think that's going to affect the end results?
Hard to say. Again, there's a history in Montana of third party voting, not winning, but third party voting. It's going to be an interesting thing to see, I think, largely because our national politics are broken. Rafe and I understand that. We hear it from people. And if people have just sort of checked out, perhaps they vote third party. I don't know, but I can tell you that we identify greatly, heavily with folks who come to our events, some libertarians, lots of Republicans, people who say it's their very first time at a political event, and they tell us they're voting for us. So we'll see what libertarian, what Kaiser gets. Don't know what that'll be, but we feel good about where we're at.
I want to talk about, your events. I was listening to when you guys were on a Missoula radio station taking calls from different voters, and some of the things that they were saying were really interesting to me. So when you're having fundraisers or events, can you tell me some of the most interesting stories that you've heard over the past few months?
Oh man, we've heard so many. I've done almost, I think, about 110 events. We've heard touching things like probably, I am not kidding you, hundreds of times, if not 1,000 now. Gosh, I've never done this. I'm going to do anything I can to get you elected. You guys give me hope. Like, I hear that a lot. We've heard horror stories from people who've been kicked off of Medicaid. We've heard horror stories from people whose property taxes have been jacked up and they're in danger of losing their homes. But I guess the overarching thing I would tell you is people who come to our events feel hope. They thought our state's politics were broken. They thought there wasn't anybody to fight for them. They thought we were just like locked into this broken national thing. And they walk out of our events. I'm telling you, every single one, nobody believes that, right? They walk out of there thinking, man, Montana's worth fighting for. These guys are going to do it. Time and time and time again, we hear feedback on that. And it honestly feels pretty damn good, but it also feels important.
Rafe, did you hear any stories from your grandpa about the Constitutional Convention, and what that time was like in state history? And has that contributed to your desire to run this year?
Growing up, the con was something that was always kind of held in pretty high regard in our family, but it was also held up as a time that showcased the best of Montana. One of the things I always come back to with the convention is the only qualification to be a delegate, other than being like 18, was you could not be a sitting politician. And so you had 100 people come together, they had to run for those offices, and none of them were in office. So there wasn't this inherent incumbency bias. And when they got there, the first thing they did, which I think reflected this way they were elected, was they said, we're not going to sit by party the way people usually do. We're going to sit alphabetically. And I mean, that's really, to me, the best of Montana. People putting aside the kind of superficial of the moment political labels and saying, okay, what can we do to really create a governing document that we're going to be proud of and our kids are going to be proud of and their kids are going to be proud of? And that, we're 52 years now since the Con. It's really stood the test of time. It's really a forward-looking document that protects individual rights. The federal Constitution sort of says we're going to create all these government powers. The state constitution of Montana, the basic insight is that the people own all political power, and we're just going to delegate some of it to the government. And so the basic premise of our constitution is we have the power, and this document protects us from the government. That's why fundamental rights play such a big role in our constitution. Those are all protections against the government. So it's a pretty cool document that folks across the spectrum can be proud of. And whether you choose to live in Montana or Montana chose you, it's something that really makes our state a special place to live.
So in a hypothetical scenario where Republicans would keep their majority in both the state House and Senate, how would you work with that body that would have so many different views than what you stand for?
So I think there's a rich history here, Ezra, of Democratic governors bringing out the best in legislature, especially Republican legislatures. I think of Medicaid expansion happened under Republican legislature and a Democratic governor. And the reason I think that's important is if you look back at this last legislative session, which was a debacle, a national embarrassment, it happened because you have single party rule, a supermajority, and then you have a governor who just says yes to everything. The worst things, that piles and piles and piles of bills, he just says yes. Does he force them and cajole them and work with them to do good things, constructive things? Not very often. He signed extreme bills, one after another after another. Yet when you have a Democratic governor, there's a rich history of getting in with good, decent, responsible Republicans who are still there. They need somebody to stand up for them, and that will be a Democratic governor. And then you find these larger, impactful policies that all Montanans need, and we move those forward. Instead of just focusing on this divisive, frankly, some of it crazy legislation that came through and clearly unconstitutional. Rafe has been very busy filing lawsuits against unconstitutional laws because these guys are passing unconstitutional laws. We need a governor to enforce decency, and there's a rich history in Montana of divided government doing that. And we look forward to leading and working with good, responsible Republicans that want to do that.
Well, you two, thanks so much for the time today. It was great to talk.
Thank you.
Hey, Ezra, you're good at this.
Thank you.
You do your homework. This is a good podcast.
That's it for today's episode. News Nerds is produced and hosted by me, Ezra Graham. Our website is newsnerdspodcast.com, where you can catch up on episodes you missed, subscribe to our email list, and contact us. News Nerds is available wherever you get podcasts, and we're also on community radio station KGVM every other Thursday at 5:30 p.m. Mountain Time. They're at kgvm.org or on your radio at 95.9 FM. Consider supporting the station at kgvm.org/support-kgvm. Thanks for being with us today.